I'm going to suggest that it's a really helpful analogy, but I'm going to define a couple terms. The corporations that I think we could talk about here are not just any old mom and pop like little corporations. These are large multinational corporations. It's the corporations that we've become kind of anxious about over the last 40, 50 years, really sort of the what was called in the late 60s, early 70s, multinationals. So it's companies that aren't just anything that happens to have submitted something to the government, but something that has taken on sort of a major life of its own. And AIs, I'm going to suggest that we should be talking about here are not just somebody's going and downloading a Python script and running some optimizer. These are things that are being applied at scale that have the ability to aggregate profiles of hundreds of millions of people kind of scale. That's the thing that I think is causing us to have some level of anxiety. And I thought I would try to suggest why it's useful to go and put these things together and then pull them apart. I'm going to say a little bit about me, and I'd say it's helpful towards the rest of this: AIs, corporations, antidotes, and then alignment. Me, I schooled at MIT, Artificial Intelligence Lab, got to hang out with awesome people, Marvin Minsky, Danny Hillis, and the like, towards trying to understand sort of this perspective. I came at it from, let's do a big data sort of library project, and I learned a bunch more about the AI ideas and how that can work, and grew up with that. Then I went off to help make a company, that's me with more hair, making a connection machine supercomputer that were awesome looking machines. And the goal of this was to try to make machines that would be proud of us. Right? That was the explicit goal of Danny Hillis, one of the two founders. The idea was to try to make thinking machines. With these thinking machines, I went off to try to make them connect to people and did a project called Wide Area Information Servers. It was the first publishing system on the net. So this is me with a connection machine trying to build vast libraries on this ARPANET thing. And then that sort of did fairly well and basically replaced with the World Wide Web. Sold a company to AOL and then sold another company to Amazon.com. So there I am, sort of in the celebratory picture, selling this company next to now the richest man in the world. So I've seen kind of the AI world and the corporations world. Then went off to go back to the library thing to try to build these whole area of big data, but for social good. And so built the Internet Archive to basically build public benefit and an open AI. When we were at the AI lab, I thought we were starved for data. We just didn't have enough data to be able to do anything interesting. And so knowing that that was going to be needed and also would be generally beneficial within an internet framework, which we could see coming within a couple of decades, I said, okay, that's worth spending my life doing. Let's see if we can go and build a library that would compute, that would be smart. And how would we do this? We would do this by going and building in the publishing system and then build a public benefit or organization. So this was my background, and a couple of years ago, I wrote this little 9-line poem. When I sort of went, eureka, I think I understand something kind of interesting, hopefully. That if we're trying to predict what AIs are going to become, then we could look at what corporations have become. That AIs, when applied at scale, are sort of simple automata. And everything I know about building corporations and how corporations run is they're relatively simple automata. I mean, they're a little bit more interesting than paperclip manufacturing, but not much. And we've allowed these things to get very, very large. If they were just paperclip makers and they sort of were kept small and Adam Smith-y, that wouldn't be so bad. But they've now become such that they're larger than many whole governments. That really, what is the sovereign power anymore? And who really holds the power in a post-Citizens United world? And I'd say it's at least debatable. And there would be people that would come down hardcore on the corporations are winning at every one of these steps against things like democracy. And so the concept of lots of small corporations, it's changed. And so it's like, okay, if we're worried about AIs, if we're trying to figure out what are they going to become, and it's just technology, but I'd say corporations are just a technology. And technology just extends the arms of man. That's at least what I think of as a technology. It extends the arms of man, but it doesn't extend the arms of all men or all people. It extends arms of things in a very unequal way. So there are some things that win more than others, that some people's arms are extended much further and faster than others, especially with things with network effects, such as the types of technologies we see on the internet, which have much more of a winner-takes-all characteristic than we even saw in paperclip manufacturers or paper mills or whatever it is. So we're having these corporations that are starting to become very large, such that they are dominating not only within one country's industry of that type, but across many countries' types. So thought, okay, if we're worried about AIs, can we learn something from corporations and what they've become, and to be able to see into the future with AIs based on seeing the history with corporations. So my little 9-line poem, which I'm gonna try to read off of the screen, is was sort of an impetus for me to sort of say, okay, something is different here. Corporations as first-generation AIs. Just as computers started out being made out of people, there was actually a title called computer. It was a human title. AIs started being made out of humans. Humans that operate their processes, the actors of the corporations. But fewer humans are needed in the large corporations. Those that remain get lots of dollars. Soon, the humans left in corporations will be as vestigial and ornamental as Fortune 500 board members. Governments will serve the corpses, and people are watched and entertained. Big data, hallelujah. Okay, not the most happy poem in the world, but I think it might be useful. I'm gonna just I had fun making little clips of this. So you can't watch a movie these days without an AI coming and killing everybody. But it wasn't always that way. When I grew up, did anybody else watch Gigantor growing up? Anyway, it was a cheesy thing, but the key thing was you're empowered, right? You're the kid that gets to go and have awesome force in a world where you never feel you have any force. And so that was kind of fun. But then later in the 60s...
Warning! Warning, my foot, be still, you bubblehead.
Look, it went on.
Crush, kill, destroy, crush, kill, destroy, crush, kill, destroy.
Okay, so things started getting a little scary, but there was kind of this ideal idea.
Computer.
History files. Subject, former Governor Codus of Tarsus IV, also known as Codus the Executioner. After that, background on actor Anton Caridian.
Working.
So then this was more my sort of, okay, let's go build that, which I think Siri is getting pretty close to. But there's still these sort of scary.
The Whopper spends all its time thinking about World War III. 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, it plays an endless series of war games.
And we had these sort of progressively more actually interesting depictions of what these AIs were going to be. And sometimes they were cute, sometimes they were not as cute, then they were cute again, and they were cute and scary sorts of AIs that will be sort of majorly part of our world. And I would even say kind of an interesting one is Minority Report's the precogs, I would say are actually better modeled as AIs than they are as people, but they don't work as well in movies, which I think is actually an important point, because if you make these things too complicated, if you can't make it look like somebody, it's difficult to put your arms around it in like a human movie way, unless you're really brilliant at it, such as Kubrick, to be able to try to put what are we dealing with here? And most recently, I think interestingly, there is a Trevor Paglen piece on how do AIs look at us? So this is AIs watching a Kronos quartet piece where there are people and AIs watching the performance. And we're getting to watch how the AI is interpreting the performance. So we're now sitting beside the AI as opposed to confronting it, but it's sort of an interesting way of sort of viewing sort of how are artists going about changing how we're looking at this. Okay, AIs with movies is a whole lot easier to look at. So I thought, okay, how has it been, corporations been viewed within sort of the popular approach? And it's difficult for it to happen. I found a couple images that I thought were kind of fun. The sort of the faceless, the business school graduate, right? The person that might have been a really smart, diverse person that understood Shakespeare and Dickens, and then put within a business school system to try to strip all of that out of them so that they could think in spreadsheets. So they could basically go and wipe out 1,000 people's jobs with a stroke of a delete key as a model, right? How do you get somebody to be able to do that? And that's, I think, what business school is all about. And we have these sort of imposing architecture that is really supposed to make us feel small. And it's just these, if you talk to the architects and the public space, it's all about sort of making us like be in awe of something much bigger and very regular and grid-like than we're in. Of course, went back to the Internet Archive to see how people might have painted the corporations. And we have all these educational films from the 1950s and 60s. They're completely awesome because they're these sort of social behavior, top-down, let's have people think differently things. And let's see if I can get it to play. Oh no, come on, please play. Video cannot be loaded. Oh. Well, it's basically this sort of, what are corporations? And it sort of does that same kind of, corporations could be big, awful things, but let's talk about the small little corporations that are kind of cute. And it reminds me of a lot of the arguments that you hear among patent people is like, we're really trying to go and defend the person that's in their garage, or we're all about trying to help the musicians, or it's really about the children. And it's like, often when it comes down to it, and I'm just old enough to know that it's actually not about those things at all. Usually it's about some very large organization trying to go and ply their trade, and they're throwing lawyers and structures such as patents and copyrights and licensing organizations at much smaller people. So corporations, I'd say, had some way of viewing them during some of the early days when we dealt with them as trusts and trust busting and thought of them as octopus. I don't know why octopuses sort of caught on in the early part of the 20th century, but they sort of had their hands in way too much. I'm going to use another clip. That's just a great clip, but it's all about being the opposite. This is about how an AI is looking at people, but I think it's more projecting. I would say this next one is a good analogy of actually what corporations have become in actually quite recently.
I'd like to share a revelation that I've had during my time here. It came to me when I tried to classify your species. I realized that you're not actually mammals. Every mammal on this planet instinctively develops a natural equilibrium with the surrounding environment, but you humans do not. You move to an area and you multiply and multiply until every natural resource is consumed. And the only way you can survive is to spread to another area. There is another organism on this planet that follows the same pattern. Do you know what it is? A virus. Human beings are a disease, a cancer of this planet. You are a plague, and we are the cure.
Love that speech. So the idea of basically something that can grow without bounds and live forever, that's what we've got with corporations. And it's, I would also say, it could be what becomes of AIs with the network effect of how things go and grow. So I was just in China. They pay for things commonly in the big cities with Alipay. Alipay is sort of like an Apple Pay or a Google Pay, but it works really much better. And people like us just have stopped carrying cash. Everything is paid for with Alipay. And on Alipay is a little display of your social credit score. This is of the things that you've bought or people you've dealt with, what they've computed your social credit score to be. And it's analogous to our Equifax kind of scores, but it's readily available. And it's being used to figure out whether you can get a loan or rent. And as now we find out, whether you're going to get on a bus or get a plane ticket. Or train ticket, excuse me. So these it's becoming these network-scale, large-scale, adaptive systems are starting to become majorly deployed and have interesting effects that are causing people to have anxieties. So, if we take this analogy, then we can look historically over what's happened with corporations, how people have tried to deal with them, and then maybe we can come up with ideas of what might happen with AIs. It's not Tom Khalil's request of what do we want of government. I don't know, but I'm looking for at least ways of trying to predict the future, and I try to look at the past and analogies to try to get there. So, antidotes to corporations. What have we done in the past to try to deal with corporations and how they've made their effects? First, the biggest one and the most successful one historically is don't let them start. Just don't let them happen in the first place. Well, how has that gone? The Dutch East India Company is kind of thought of as the first real modern corporation, shareholders and spreading into, in case, if you actually like what happened to India, then I think it might be thought of as a positive thing that the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company and those other sort of similar types of corporations happened. But there were a few of them, and they got very big, very fast, and they were very impactful in a way. But they didn't, in general in the United States, we didn't allow them to happen. They kind of snuck in after 1865 as trusts. They sort of learned how to use this trust law to go and make what kind of became things like the railroad trusts, the oil trusts, and the like, and they became so hideous so fast that it was but enormously difficult to get rid of because the people on top of them were very, very wealthy, and they could go and control a lot of the government levers. That we got the Sherman antitrust laws through it all is pretty freaking amazing. So the next antidote was antitrust regulation. And it was very difficult to put this in place, but it did huge things. They smashed the Standard Oil trusts, and they basically broke them up into separate states. They basically said you had to stay within a state. That was an easy enough regulation to try to make it so that these things would stay somewhat small. So Esso, which was short for Standard Oil, was broken up into Standard Oil of New Jersey, which is what you think of as Esso, which then became Exxon. But there was also Standard Oil Company of Indiana, Sohio, which is Standard Oil, Ohio. Standard, which became, with their logo, became Chevron of California, was basically a breaking up. It was a method of trying to keep these things small. Well, of course, that didn't end up working because they controlled the government well enough to let them basically hoover each other up and merge, for instance, with mobile. But it kind of worked for a while. Banks were broken up also by state. So they were limited to being in state. So the National City Bank, which was the bank in New York, basically became huge because New York was huge, and Bank of America in California. So, and then there were lots of banks in between, and that worked until the 1980s when we basically allowed them to all hoover each other up again and encourage them, even through the too big to fail, to become even bigger. The savings and loans worked for it had this interesting way of being defined. You could only have customers within 75 miles. So when I grew up, I had a little passbook, and there was the Scarsdale National Savings and Loans, and I had my little passbook. They could only make business within 75 miles. It kept money local. But this was deregulated in the 1980s with Keating and McCain, and it blew up very quickly. There's credit unions were awesome. They flourished until 1972 when there was creation of the National Credit Union Administration, and the number of credit unions went up until 1972, and now it's been going down at 300 to 500 credit unions per year, and it has ever since. So there was this antitrust regulation that tried to work, but it doesn't seem to be really working anymore. Another antidote to corporations that were tried was unions. So unions was sort of a mechanism of trying to basically build up enough of a power structure to counter the corporate power structures. And so instead of solving the problem by not letting them start or whatever, let's try unions. Well, that worked for a while, and then didn't. So basically it went up in terms of the number of union membership went up, and then famously sort of came crashing down again after Reagan. So this was another sort of approach. Now, am I suggesting any of these have to do with AIs? No, but I'm suggesting that we've tried all sorts of things to deal with extremely large concentrations of power in the past. And I'm going to suggest that there is another that's actually could be, and it's kind of interesting, and it's the non-profit corporations. Non-profit corporations, I think, are fantastically interesting and underexploited as an idea. Just as the United States propagated the C corporation, which I think is a virus, around the world that is having enormous effects, positive and large part negative, it also created and debugged this nonprofit 501c3 structure. And so I've now run successfully organizations, and I've been inside of very large AOL, Amazon, and understand a little bit of how they think and work. These nonprofits are interesting. And Wikipedia, EFF, Mozilla, Internet Archive, we have, even in the high-tech infrastructure area, not just advocacy, we're seeing some of these things work. Why? And why do they last so long? So Internet Archive is now 21 years old, EFF is 28 years old, and my different companies only lasted a few years before they were acquired. One of the things about nonprofits is there's no incentive for acquisition. There's no incentive from the CEO or the board members to look for acquisition. And I love these sort of talks of synergy. It's like, yeah, maybe. Maybe just somebody's going to make a lot of money by pocketing corporate level wealth personally. And hey, I did very well out of that. I sold a couple companies and made serious money that way. I can tell you what the incentives are. You're going to sell as soon as you can. It's a whole lot easier to just like, done, and then you get a whole pot of gold and it's somebody else's problem. And this has been going on at tremendous levels at not just small organizations being hoovered up, but large organizations. But in nonprofits, there's almost no incentive to. They can sell, they just don't because there's not an incentive to. And so that, I think, goes and pops the bubble of the synergy argument, because if it really were just, if there wasn't an incentive, it would happen as often as acquisitions and nonprofits. What else are different? They're mission-driven, not profit-driven. I remember trying to have to say shareholder value as if I meant it. It was very difficult. It's a very weird form of motivation structure, but it does have an effect. When Ben and Jerry's, which is sort of one of your, they made their brand based on being good to their employees and good to their people. When they sold out to Unilever, that was like, what the heck happened here? And the story is one of the Ben and Jerry, I don't remember which, said basically he was faced with a fiduciary responsibility issue that made it so he did something that he thought was absolutely wrong by his employees and his customers. So whether it's real or not, can you get sued on all like that? They think they can. But in nonprofit corporations, it doesn't happen. The closest analogy is, so they grew out of somewhat like the Richard Stallman's idea of how to make a system work when the overall copyright system became too oppressive. So open source and free and open source software came out of the 1976 Copyright Act when they basically made everything property. And the first thing that blew up was software. And so a bunch of us were at MIT working on the MIT list machine software, Richard Stallman as well. We were writing code to go and put into the greater sphere, but it was forked by MIT because in 1976, he said, okay, if everything's property, MIT said, well, if everything's property, that must be mine. Therefore, I can sell it. So they sold it to Symbolics, and Symbolics forked it. Richard Stallman understood that basically if you fork it, the company's gonna die, they all do, but do we lose the list machine with it? And he tried very hard to go and keep the list machine alive. With the list machine, by going and coding as much as all of the people in Symbolics. It almost killed him. And at the point where he said, look, I'm just not gonna win at this, he said the problem was the copyright scheme. And he came up with this concept of the GNU license, of basically making a bubble within an oppressive regime where you have better rules within yourselves. So you can basically make sub-rules within society. That was the way I interpreted what Stallman did. Fricking brilliant. And he made sharing some rights reserved, as Larry Lessig came to call it, is a mechanism of voluntarily not asserting all of your rights. And that system worked better, and it changed how the whole software industry evolved from there. So free and open source software worked. I think that this idea of some rights reserved applied to corporations is what our nonprofit corporations are. We have voluntarily gone and given up certain things, some exploitations that we can do. And I wrote a paper on this subject of sort of, okay, what if we take this Stallman idea, apply it to organizations? I'd say that's what Wikipedia and Internet Archive and the like are doing. And can you even apply it to things like housing? Some rights reserved is a way that we might want to think about potential alignment of AIs. That AIs, and I'd say it's AIs at scale. If we're trying to predict what they might become, maybe this corporation analogy is useful for a predictive thing. Whether it's exactly predictive of what we should do in government, I'm not gonna say. But I found that this was a different thing than thinking it's gonna be Skynet, or it's gonna be robots running around crushing and killing us, right? Which is what we're mostly seeing in the anxiety-ridden movie structure now. But is there something more subtle that allows us to try to predict what's going to happen? And of course, if you come to a library, you're going to end up with a reading list. These are my favorite books on the subject. Cornered by Barry Lynn is a really good book about what happened to the industrial system in the United States, basically the rise of monopoly capitalism. So this isn't capitalism corporations competing with each other. This is post-capitalist corporate structure like in the United States. My paper, which is down here, and there's the Visible Hand. I found a really interesting book. When I posed to Will Hurst, who at the time was working at Will Hurst as in Hearst, when he was working at Kleiner Perkins, I said, I'm not sure I believe in these C corporations. And he said, well, you're not the only one. And he gave me this book. And he suggested I read a particular chapter on the rise of management structures, of business structures in the United States. And it turns out this concept of a corporation that we think of as God-given, or it's always been there, is not. It's really recent. They were basically very different business structures. So lastly, I think we can achieve better AI alignment if we think about this analogy, and I hope that this is a useful analogy to you. Thank you very much.